Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Conflicting narratives and competing agendas. This is the tragedy of the Syrian conflict. Western media coverage is focused on forcing political outcomes. In the process, the truth is often overlooked and even denied. Another casualty of war. Jonathan, you're a noted journalist. You have a very long and distinguished career. What in the world has happened? Particularly in this conflict? We could look at other conflicts in the world, Ukraine, and you've talked about that on this program here. But I'm calling this program the media's Syria, because in Western media, primarily in the mainstream, they have a paradigm about what's happening in that country right now, and it is very much at odds with reality that is happening on the ground. It is a propaganda war, from what I can see. How did it happen? You've been in the business a long time. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's partly because there's a sort of romanticism about rebellions against any government. It started with the Arab Spring. Well, of course, it started decades ago, but in recent times it started with the Arab Spring. Anybody who's protesting against a government, like in Cairo and Tunis, is automatically supported. And that's now been transferred to Syria. So the people, the rebels in Aleppo, are treated as the good guys with the white hats and heroes, and nothing they do is wrong. And anything that the Russians or the Syrian government does is automatically wrong. I mean, look at the story of the US-led coalition's attack on the Syrian government positions near Deir ez-Zor, when at least 62 government soldiers were killed. That story died in about 2 hours. I mean, if it had been the other way around, you can imagine we'd be still talking about it 3 weeks later.
Well, we'd probably be talking about how Damascus looks like one huge crater. I think that's what we'd be talking about. Scott, if I can go to you in San Francisco, and thank you for getting up so early to join us here today. One of the great myths that, and it's perpetuated over and over again, is the term moderate. And from what I can tell in looking at people that have been on the ground and real experts, not people that don't want to peddle a fairy tale about Western values and all of this nonsense that we hear nonstop. I mean, they all tell me the term moderate is an illusion. It's a fantasy that comes out of Western media.
Yeah, it's an amazing degeneration of the American media mind, and I would say no good journalist or newspaper has really come out of the United States since 1980. I think all the good ones stopped writing in the 70s. And you see, I'll put on my PSYOP hat for a minute, you see a coordination between the American media and the government policy. We've seen it since 9/11. We've seen it in the taking down of countries, 5 countries in 7 years. And you see a media that is backing this myth that the moderates exist, and they're trying to overthrow a tyranny and a dictator that's, in Assad's case, bombing his own people. And it's complete nonsense. And I about jump out of my seat when I hear people like Sean Hannity say the Russians, the Iranians are working with the radical Islamic jihadis. And I say to myself, that is absolutely a lie, because the Russians and the Iranians are the only ones looking for peace and stability in the Middle East. The radical jihadis are the Saudi Arabian Wahhabi Salafists that the United States has been backing, in addition to Qatar and Kuwait and all these nations that have been financing terrorism. Now, the American media, the good news is, Peter, there are thinking men and thinking honest men in Washington that are not buying the media drivel anymore. We are standing up. We're listening to a lot of sources such as RT, such as your experts in your show, and we're coming together with a different narrative. And from an emotional point, we see John Kerry, we see Obama, we see Hillary Clinton having a sort of a mental breakdown. You can tell when people lie. You can tell when they stutter.
You know, Daniel, that's a very good point. That's exactly where I wanted to go. I mean, I watched some of the State Department briefings, and I call the press corps that show up there the stenographers union, because all they do is write it down, and there are 2 or 3 people that sometimes ask questions. I mean, how did we get to this point here? I mean, if you go off the reservation, if you don't have the right narrative, you're not going to be published. Are you worried about your career? I mean, I can tell when these people are listening to these briefings that they're not really convinced, but anyway, they write it down. Go ahead.
America has a free press, but it's a very weak press and a very unindependent press. There's a sort of very strong patriotic impulse that the politics stop at the water's edge, and what happens abroad is the prerogative of the U.S. government. And also, I think the Middle East is such a difficult topic for Americans that they tend to defer to to Washington's guidance in this regard. But there's no doubt the press has been astonishing, especially on the Syrian question, in terms of its obedience to Washington dictates, little independent thought, complete marching in lockstep. It's really amazing.
You know, Jonathan, when there was the part of Aleppo was under siege, I'll use what Scott said. I fell out of my chair when they're saying that government forces, Assad's forces, are besieging the city. And it was just, the story was completely turned upside down. And I tried to look if there was any kind of corrections or anyone was going to interrogate it, and there was absolutely nothing. I mean, I can understand what different interpretations, but I mean, that's simply not facts that can be reported because it didn't happen.
Well, what about the issue of the ceasefire agreement? I mean, the Russians wanted it to be published, the one that they'd made with the US. The US refused to publish it. Well, where's the freedom? Where's the openness? Where's the speech, freedom of speech and all that? I mean, what was the reason for keeping it so quiet? I mean, one perhaps reason is that it required certain things of the rebels. They had to separate themselves from the al-Nusra Front, the al-Qaeda-linked al-Nusra Front. It's changed its name, of course, to Fatah al-Sham, but it's the same people with the same ideology. And they refused to separate so that there was no chance that they'd be bombed, because the agreement was that the Russians and the Syrians would not bomb the so-called moderate forces. They had to separate themselves.
Scott, you know, one of the extraordinary things in the coverage of Syria in the West is that it is the Syrian army that has been doing the heavy lifting for years, fighting terrorism. But you wouldn't get a whiff of that idea from mainstream media.
Well, Peter, it'll delight you to know that I'm going to be talking with Senator Dick Black after your show, and I'm going to bring him all the great points that you're making. He is one of the American politicians that is standing up for President Assad and for Russia and for Iran, that is saying these countries represent stability in the Middle East. And he's said before, what have we become as Americans where we're backing these boy-beheading, women-raping savages that have been causing turmoil and destabilization and infiltrating the Middle East? So these American journalists, and I would correct one thing. These journalists, I don't think we have much of a free press anymore. I think we have a press that is dominated with corporate interests, with big donors, with big money, and they follow the stream. They don't have a love of truth anymore. There's no men of letters. There's no educated poets that really take language seriously. And as a PSYOP guy, I know the hearts and minds are influenced by language. And the American people, Peter, it should encourage you, they're very well familiar with the Russian people and the Russian culture, and I always correct people who try and label Russians Soviets. Yep. No, sorry, they are the Russians, they are the Russian people and the Russian culture, and they represent better values than most American media do.
That happened to you when you were on Press TV a couple of days ago. I'm glad that you picked up on that, because it happens sometimes. Daniel, where do we go from here? Because one of the things I find very troubling is that Iran has been demonized by the United States for many, many years. Okay, it's a generational thing ever since 1979. And then we have Russia, that used to be the Soviet Union. These are familiar enemies to a Western audience, okay? And it seems to me that paradigm fits in very well. It's a lazy way of thinking. And I saw it would happen with Scott. I mean, he was debating someone on another channel, and they used the word Soviet. And it seems to me it's just a template that people like to use. And, oh, well, Iran and Russia, their friend is Syria, so that friend must be a bad guy and against us. Go ahead.
Well, I think that it's amazing how these conflicts persist through regime changes from the Soviets to the Russian Federation. But I think that the U.S. wants to keep a tight grip on this region of the world, and is very jealous of any intrusion of outside powers, especially Russia. So the U.S. is guarding it as its private turf. It's making a complete mess of things. It's a total disaster. It's destroying a country. But nonetheless, it claims the right to be able to do that in its own what it regards as its own backyard.
You know, Jonathan, one of the extraordinary things is that if this war continues, there will be more refugees leaving the country, going to other places, into the European Union. And that's one of the primary reasons why Russia agreed to intervene legally under international law, because Russia itself will also be impacted on that. And this radicalism can go into the Caucasus. I mean, it's just common sense, but that common sense never gets translated into the mainstream media.
No, and then you got these extraordinary statements from the man who was the head of NATO forces in Europe, supreme commander in Europe, claiming that Assad was, quotes, weaponizing, unquotes, the refugees. I mean, what an incredible image. I mean, somehow that Assad has control over millions of refugees and can turn them into weapons. I mean, it's bizarre.
Scott, you know, can you reflect upon that? Because, you know, there's no agency with the Syrian people. They're just subjected to terror. That's what we hear all the time. It's not true.
It's absolutely false. Now, the other alarming thing is with the degeneration of the American media, and I think you're going to have a retraction of the American military footprint out of the Middle East, because I honestly think, and I hope Donald Trump steps up and beats Hillary Clinton, because that's our only pathway to peace. Hillary Clinton wants war. I think Trump would back us away from that. But here's what's alarming. When this Syrian operation happened, which was not an accident, I know that from my experience in the military and the intelligence services.
Hold that thought. Okay, gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break. And after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on media coverage of Syria State with our team. Okay, I'd like to go back to San Francisco. I had to jump in there. Go ahead, Scott. You can finish your point.
Well, when you had the Syrian operation where the Americans bombed and destroyed the Syrian forces with A-10s and F-16s, you simultaneously had operations within the United States, which people in the community and the psychological warfare and military environment have looked at as coordinated operations to delude and detract the American consciousness away from Syria into the United States. And specifically, you had a bombing in New York. You had a disruption of a Marine marathon parade. You had 60 schools in Canada evacuated, all supposedly because of domestic disturbances. Now you've got a Black Lives Matter shootings. They do this to distract Americans away from Syria, away from the Middle East, away from the United Nations Potential War Crimes Tribunal for declarations of war, away from the fact that the United States bombed or with Mossad and Israel, bombed the other convoy with laser technology. Americans don't see that because they're distracted by the media to these other alternative information sources. That shows me and many, many others that the American media cannot be trusted. The alternative media that is rising up has much more sway on people. But I think in the long-term geopolitical interest, as the American footprint begins to pull back from the Middle East, you're going to have an increasing domestic disruptive state in the United States. And, you know, it doesn't bode well for the United States. But I would also end it by saying Vladimir Putin has a great opportunity, as does Iran and China. They have the opportunity to appeal directly to the American people. You can't trust John Kerry. He's a liar. You can't trust Samantha Power. She's a liar, as is Barack Obama. But they can write a general letter to the American people in the New York Times, the Washington Post, saying, "Dear American people, we do not want a war. If you don't want one either, vote with your heart. Vote to stop these wars. Vote to reject the candidates that want those wars. The American people would support it."
Well, Vladimir Putin had an op-ed not long ago. I think it was in the New York Times, and it was a good op-ed, but it was completely vilified by everyone because they don't know anything about Russia. But let me go to Daniel here. One of the things I find really extraordinary, and I think this is the media's fault and maybe American education and ethos when it comes to foreign politics, but in 1 week's time, during the course of 1 week, Obama ordered bombings or drone attacks in 7 different countries in the world. And this is a Nobel Prize winner. But Americans don't even flinch about that. I mean, the American activity in Syria specifically is against international law. It's a gross violation of sovereignty. But Americans are never taught to think in those terms. And that's why they don't flinch about it. Because, that's what we do. Well, that's simply what we do. I mean, in the 1960s, it was the American media that tipped the balance against the war in Vietnam. But I see the media now is just in lockstep with power. Go ahead, Daniel.
Well, first of all, Peter, I want to emphasize that that there's no evidence of any broader coordination where the U.S. military is somehow arranging the shooting of black people in Charlotte, North Carolina, or that somehow Mossad is involved in the bombing of the convoy in Aleppo. That's, to me, is just crazy talk. The things are bad enough, but the problem in the U.S. is
provide the evidence.
Let me finish.
No, let's say with Daniel. Go ahead. Go ahead, Daniel.
But the problem is that the U.S. policy is in total shambles in Syria. The various agencies are working at cross purposes with one another. There are signs of conflict between the Pentagon and the State Department. Possibilities of sabotage, of each one sabotaging the other's operations. It's a shambles. It's not a well-coordinated intelligence operation across the board. It's just a shambolic, farcical operation. And about the American people, I think that you are being a bit unfair.
Okay.
The American people are not enthusiastic about these adventures. They're not enthusiastic at all. They have lost faith in the ability of the American establishment to run these operations. They think that these imperialist adventures are getting nowhere. I think that's one reason why Trump is as popular as he is, and why Clinton just seems to be such a hollow person who's just repeating the same old tired line that somehow the U.S. is winning the war against ISIS, when the American people know that it really isn't. These forces are growing more and more powerful, and
yes, but I mean, but Daniel, but I think it's really crucial also to point out is that the American people are not aware of the backing that certain American intelligence agencies and administrations are backing up the bad guys here. And I mean, if you were to explain to them who these people really are and take out the word moderate, I would hope that they would be appalled, but they're not told that. I mean, read every major broadsheet, American allies in the region, rebels, American-backed rebels. I mean, they use this fictional language here. I mean, if they knew who those people really were, then I think that maybe they would be a lot more questioning. But if you don't know that, then why would you question? Go ahead, Daniel.
The American people know all too well that they live in a huge oligarchy where the people themselves have little control over foreign policy. Listen, Obama is going to veto the 9/11 Justice Bill, which will allow the victims of 9/11 to sue Saudi Arabia, or at least to investigate Saudi Arabia's involvement. It's a travesty. It's a shocking injustice. And this is not lost on the American people, but they don't know what to do about it. They're at a loss. Their government is out of their control. They don't trust it. They don't believe it. They think it's incompetent, but they don't know how to bring it back under control. So therefore, they turn the news off and they put on the ball game or whatever. But I think the American people are not at all happy with the way things are going.
Jonathan, is this a phenomenon because Obama is such a weak president when it comes to foreign policy? I mean, he has his underlings, contradicting him in public, a different agency saying what different agendas they have. And we have Ash Carter here that says, no, I won't back the ceasefire. I mean, and I have the power. I can force it, the ceasefire agreement not to come into play. I mean, is this a function of the deep state of what's happening here and we're just seeing behind the veil, or is it because Obama is just playing golf?
Well, I think he has shown himself to be weak on this point that you've raised about Ash Carter. I mean, a previous president of the United States would have sacked the defense secretary immediately. You can't publicly oppose a key issue of foreign policy like what's going on in Syria. So that is a sign of weakness. But I mean, the other thing is there's a basic contradiction which they've never resolved, which is who do you support in Syria? Is it the Syrian government, or is it the people who are trying to topple the Syrian government, whether it's IS or the so-called moderate rebels? They never seem to get that right. One minute they're saying, yes, Assad can stay in power a bit longer. Yes, he represents some sort of secularism and some sort of stability and some sort of protection of minorities. But on the other hand, he's a brutal dictator who bombs his own people and so on. They keep getting themselves caught in these contradictions. Well, of course, there are certain contradictions in any foreign policy. But you have to finally get off the fence and say, look, do we support Assad because he stands for more better things than the other side, or do we support the other side? They're trying to have it both ways. They somehow want Assad and the ISIS people to disappear like a puff of smoke with a wave of a magic wand. It's not going to happen.
You know, Scott, I find it really tragic that a lot of media always tries to look for virtue, and when politics is not about virtue, unfortunately. It's a different species here. But, you know, Scott, you know what? Just recently, John Kerry is calling for a no-fly zone. And with the ceasefire, I mean, it was an amazing step. The Assad government agreed, because Russia was going to back it up, that certain areas there would not be any planes. Okay, that was part of the deal. Now Kerry's saying, after the Americans bomb Syria and kill Syrian troops, now he wants this again. And I went through all the major papers before we came and convened here today. And when I first read this, I thought, well, my goodness. I mean, now the United States will be official air cover of ISIS and other terrorist groups. But as I was reading all the broadsheets, nobody came up with the same conclusion. But mine is the obvious conclusion. But no one there is talking about it. This is what I'm getting at. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah. Well, keep in mind, there's in a military frame of mind, you have a goal, you have objectives, you have strategy, you have tactics. The goal of the United States since George Bush carried under Obama has been U.S. hegemony over the world. That's the goal. The objective has been destabilization of the competitors. The strategy has been destabilizing these countries from within, and the tactic has been using the injector as human rights violations and religious persecution, playing the victim card. So there's a goal, objective, strategy, tactics that the United States has been waging against Russia diplomatically, militarily, economically, and informationally. So you see John Kerry and these other puppets starting to lie and fumble and fall all over themselves and look down at the ground and get nervous when they tell these lies. The American public don't buy it. Many of us in the military love Russia. We love the Russian personality and cultures. I worked with Russians in the military, and I have seen a lot, Peter. I saw it at the State Department. I saw it in the Army. There's a lot of horrific stuff that's causing people like me to come out and speak truth, because this isn't just about destabilizing, a region. This is about threatening all of the world and civilization. The United States has caused so much chaos and havoc, it shames me. And so does it many other politicians to say, what have we become? Okay. What in the heck are we doing? We have ravaged Europe, and the way to correct it is to have good people rise up to Congress, and I will do that myself, taking this platform, and I will challenge people.
Let me go to Daniel. Give Daniel here the last word here. Daniel, again, returning to the media. I mean, we had all of this coverage of the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003, and we see it repeated over and over again, and I don't see anybody in media held accountable. Do you agree with that or not?
No one's held accountable. Assuming that Hillary's elected, we'll have one of the key backers of that 2003 invasion back in the White House, and all the major neocons will be enjoying power. They'll be drinking champagne, enjoying their power like they never have before.